Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning for the webinar Machinery Management, Approaches to Managing Your Machinery Cost. As a quick reminder, all attendees are muted and videos are shut off. However, we'd love for you to engage with us today using the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. You can find that chat feature by clicking the three dots on the bottom of your screen if you're on a mobile device, or selecting chat if you're joining us from a computer. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce you to our experts on the call today. First, we have very own Director of Retail Credit Underwriting, Gary Book, and I'm Mike Amensing, your Customer Education Manager. So today, the two of us are going to be talking through a critical aspect of farm management, managing your machinery costs. As we all know, machinery costs continue to rise and net farm income continues to be projected lower. And so growers are looking for an opportunity to reduce costs and effectively utilize their capital. And so that's really how we came to today's topic. Our goal is to share some ideas and as well as some tips and provide you some key ratios that you could consider when discussing your machinery costs in your operation. As a reminder, this webinar is intended for informational purposes only and is not for public or media consumption. So any opinions expressed by the presenters are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of Farm Credit Mid-America. If you're not able to join us for the entirety of the webinar, no fear. We will be recording today's call and we'll share it out following the webinar later today. And so let's go ahead and just get started, Gary. First off, I want to call your attention to the graph on the screen. This was compiled by our friends over at AEI, but is utilizing database or information from FinBin database that illustrates the trend in machinery cost per acre from 2005 to 2023 with a 50-50 corn and soybean rotation. And so as you can see, we've had significant increase in machinery costs from 2020 to 2023 that many of you all on the call are probably feeling. The data suggests that it was an increase of $37 per acre or 32% increase, which has kind of led us to this conversation today. How do we reduce that expense on our farm, or at least be more aware of it? Additionally, we should note that the data on this slide as well as the next is going to consider things like economic depreciation, interest, repairs, and insurance cost, which is a little bit different than how we look at it at Farm Credit Mid-America. So Gary will cover that here in just a moment as to how we look at machinery costs, but I wanted to call that note out. And so if you've been purchasing machinery from 2020 to 2023, you've probably felt this increase on your farm. 32% is a pretty significant increase. What do you say, Gary? It's definitely made an impact on the farm. And so now let's look at it from an investment per acre and how that change has happened for growers.
So yeah, Micah, thanks for having me on the call today. But this chart, I think, tells me a lot, and it should tell you all a lot too, of really what you've been feeling for the last couple of years. Of when we go out and talk to customers, we hear consistently that equipment costs are getting really high. And that first chart really just shows you that. I mean, as you can see, 32% in just a couple of years. That's a big jump, and it's something we have to manage around. It's a little bit out of our control, and it's really just something that it's just part of our day-to-day operations. So this chart here, it really kind of says the same thing, but it's something that I think is really important. It's something as working in credit for the last 13 years is really is what I've paid attention to. And really the last 3 years to me is kind of telling of how much it has increased. So this chart's simply just saying how much a dollar amount per acre are you investing in machinery on your operation. And as you can see, going back to really 2013, this has been right around $600 an acre, a little bit less than $600 an acre. And starting back in 2022, it's jumped up over 600, and in 23 even went over $700 an acre. And I would be willing to bet that 24 data is going to show that probably above $700 an acre as well. So historically, I said a minute ago, we've always looked at trying to keep this at below that $600 an acre. But now, really, we're not sure if this is a trend that's going to be consistent on that $700 an acre plus, or is it going to be something may change in the marketplace where this could start dropping down. So we're really kind of uncertain. Is this kind of a new paradigm of where our benchmark's getting set now at 700 versus 600. So it's something we're keeping an eye on, and we thought it was important for you to share with you all too, to keep an eye on in your own operation.
And so Gary and I sat down and we had a conversation about what are those key ratios that folks should really be keeping an eye on and considering. And so here's what we landed on: equipment payments per acre, the equipment expense ratio, and then lastly, our liquidity or our working capital divided by VFP. One that we continue to go back and forth on was one that's becoming more relevant, in the most recent times, if you will, and that's our interest expense ratio. But I'm putting into the chat a link to a webinar that we just had not too long ago that covered that ratio pretty extensively. And so I've included that if you'd like to learn more about. But these are the three that we kind of landed on for machinery management and some things to consider. And so, Gary, kind of talk us through this equipment payments per acre and what it is and why do we look at it?
Yeah, so this number really kind of relates back to the first slide that Micah shared with you, but it's a little bit different. We're really just looking at the actual payments you're making. So it's not including any of your repair costs, any of your insurance costs, or anything you have on your equipment. For us, it's kind of hard to really separate those out, know what's truly equipment costs. So we really just kind of focus on the payments. It will get you to a very similar space or spot that first slide was showing you, and they do trend in a very similar direction. So this is something we've also found over the years. It's really easy for customers to kind of calculate on their own. It's data that's really easily found on their balance sheets or income statements. They can pull that out, divide that by the acres they're going to cross for the upcoming year, and they can get this number to help them really kind of benchmark where their equipment payments are and really help them make better management decisions on managing their equipment depth and their inventory for the upcoming year. So with that being said, this number has changed along with the investment per acre that I just talked about a minute ago. But one of the biggest things here is really just trying to help you understand of how much debt can the per acre basis really support. And as you start investing more and more in equipment, your payments increase. This number is going to increase unless you're adding additional acres to help cover that cost. So really, our moderate range is about $63 to $94 per acre of machinery payments. Now, this is just kind of a good rule of thumb. This is not like a ratio that we use to underwrite any loans or anything like that. It's really more so for you as an operator to have a better understanding of where your costs are going and how much revenues that per acre can produce can only cover so much. So this just allows you where that's going to. So this is just kind of an efficiency type ratio. It's not a standard by no means, but as you start getting up over $94 an acre, you're really kind of putting a lot of your gross revenues back to one small segment of the cost on your operation. So this kind of helps you benchmark of where you're best deploying your capital year over year.
And Gary, we can also look at that in a ratio perspective as well. So talk us through what that looks like.
Yeah, so this is it's very similar to the previous one, but we're going to take the same exact cost. So it's just your principal and interest on equipment loans, any equipment rent that you may have, any capital lease payments you may have, any custom hire expense, and you divide that by your gross revenues or your value of farm production. And we've really found is that if you keep your equipment expense within that 8 to 12% of your gross revenues, that's really kind of a good sweet spot. That's where you still got ample enough room for your other costs that for your gross revenues to cover. So this is just a good sweet spot of that 8 to 12% for you to kind of keep this expense category in. And really what that 8 to 12% is telling you, so if for every dollar of gross revenue that you make on your farming operation, 8 to 12 cents of it, that's going to go to some sort of equipment payment. Anytime you get a little bit higher in that, again, you're spreading yourself a little bit thin on your cash flow. And it's something for you to really start considering, where should I start kind of cutting some costs? So is it either on equipment payments or is it somewhere else in your operation? So it's just another good way for you to manage your operation and manage your costs on your equipment to really make sure that your operation can be successful.
Then the last one we're going to talk about is liquidity, which has been a focus of conversation as things start to get tighter on the working capital front.
Yeah, so liquidity, or it's another it's the liquidity ratio we use at Farm Credit Mid America is your working capital, the value of farm production, so or your gross revenues. Uh, this is something we decided we wanted to put in here because really equipment purchases can impact working capital or liquidity in a couple different ways. If you buy equipment with cash, that obviously pulls down your working capital and it can impact that pretty significantly. Also, even if you do term out or get a loan for your equipment purchase, that current portion of principal or your principal payment on that loan also can impact working capital. So this is something that we just wanted to talk about because we feel like these ratios all kind of tie together. It's something to be looking at consistently, especially with kind of the drop in working capital we've seen over the last really 12 months or so. Commodity prices have dropped pretty significantly, as most of you know, and that's really put kind of a strain on some individuals' working capital. So a lot of this is we're putting this out there just for you to kind of help understand that, hey, let's protect the working capital we still have on our balance sheet, and what are some different ways that we can help manage that. And really, your equipment purchases can help swing that or help that in many different ways. So just highlighting this again is the main purpose of this. This is something that's discussed quite a bit, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this ratio. But one of the things we consistently tell our producers is just really try to keep that around 20 to 30% of your gross revenues. So for every dollar you make, we would like to see about 20 cents to 30 cents of that retained back on the balance sheet. So.
And so maybe you're at a point where you've kind of scribbled down these ratios and made some quick calculations as Gary and I have went through these. And so now you're starting to think about, okay, how do I get from that moderate to low risk situation? And so we've kind of come up with 3 different strategies that we wanted to highlight. And we want to give the disclaimer that nothing here is probably earth shattering. And through Gary and I's conversation, the one thing that continued to come out was that across the board, machinery management style approaches really is pretty consistent in the ag industry. There's really not a whole lot of outliers, and so we don't have a crystal ball of the perfect thing to do, but we did want to be able to provide some thoughts or some strategies that would maybe just give you some questions to ponder and maybe spark some conversations on the farm. And so this very first one is take inventory of your equipment. One conversation that we had was that we know that there is a lot of iron that sits out in barns that really doesn't get seen or sees the light of day a whole lot. And so the questions that you can ask yourself when thinking about, the inventory of your equipment is, have I used this piece of equipment in the last 12 months? Would it be possible to rent this piece of equipment if the use is so irregular? And lastly, could selling this asset improve my working capital or liquidity position? So if you're in a situation right now where maybe you are looking to increase that liquidity position to that 20 to 30% metric, are there assets on the farm that are underutilized, and could you deploy that capital in a little bit different of a way, maybe by selling that asset or reevaluating if it truly was needed on the farm? The next one, Gary, is more kind of a unique co-oping idea. Tell us about where you've seen this work.
Yeah, so this can work in several different ways, and I think for the right operation, it is a very viable solution to some issues. But if you are looking at maybe purchasing some sort of specialized equipment that doesn't get utilized a lot on your operation, there's opportunities maybe to work with some of your neighbors and see if they have a need for that same piece of equipment, and you guys share it throughout the year. So my biggest piece of advice is how do you plan that out? Do you have that plan before you're going into the busy time of the year? Who's going to use it when? How are you going to use it? How do you utilize that asset through those time sensitive windows? Those are all important things to really start hashing out if you are going to do some equipment sharing with a neighbor, because no one wants to no one really wants to have an intense need to have that asset immediately, and your neighbor's got it, and you can't get your stuff done in a timely manner. So think through, have that planned out. And then also, when you do purchase that asset, is there a way that you can generate additional revenues from it? Can you then, maybe working with your neighbor, uh, do some other work, do some custom hire income, get generate additional revenues for that asset, so it generates more income for both individuals. So those are some. It's just kind of another way to think through some things. It's not always for every operation, but there is certain instances where a certain piece of equipment does work well for this.
And Gary, can you tell us, just to kind of make this a little bit more real, tell us an example of where you have seen this work, and maybe some of the credit packages that you've serviced?
Yeah, I've seen it in several different ways. I've seen this work well with like tiling equipment. I've seen it work well with planting and harvesting equipment with certain arrangements. But probably one of the most common ways we see this is maybe even with a sprayer. Couple farmers get together. They want to buy a larger sprayer for efficiency's sake, so they can get across more acres quickly. But maybe they just don't have an operation big enough really to buy one of the large sprayers out there. So that they'll work with a neighbor potentially to buy one together. They share the capital cost on it and all the operating costs, according to their acres if it's going over. And they work through that to where they get a large sprayer, and they're able to cover a lot of acres very quick on their operation. They're getting their crops sprayed in a timely manner, but yet they're not having that huge capital obligation of buying it on their own operation. They're spreading that across a couple different operations.
And our third and final one here is avoid accelerated depreciation and debt traps. And so before that next purchase, let's say you've already taken advantage of strategy 1 and 2, and so now you're really thinking about maybe what is that next purchase. The ratios look good, and so we've put some questions that we hope that you'll ponder. And does that piece of equipment fill a specific need, or how many areas of the operation would benefit from this purchase? Right now when we're talking about deploying critical capital, it's so important to be able to justify where is that asset going to provide the most value. And our hope is that it provides value in more than just one area of the farm. The second is, how does this purchase affect my cash flow and not just my tax bill? Gary and I, have conversations with customers frequently about, we get to year end, November, December, and we start to get a little bit nervous about that tax liability that maybe is going to be coming up. And so that shiny new paint looks pretty exciting in comparison to paying old Uncle Sam. But one of my favorite sayings from Dr. David Cole was that he never met a farmer go broke paying taxes. And so as we kind of think about that, is there an opportunity to have a conversation and say, hey, how will this affect my cash flow and not just my tax bill? And is it really in the best decision for the operation to go forward with this way? Number 3, what is the value of the piece you're purchasing on the secondary market? Is there going to be a resale opportunity once that asset has run its course on your farm and you maybe no longer need it? Or even, is there an opportunity to purchase that asset on the secondary market today? What does that market look like? And then number 4, what's the financing option for this purchase? We'd encourage you to work with your financial officer and ask those questions around, is it best to put this on an IT note or maybe even lease the equipment? Or what does it purchasing look like with just cash? And what would that do to my liquidity? So all conversations that we hope that you'll have with the financial officer before you go ahead and make that purchase. This next slide really comes down to kind of the nuts and bolts of why we're talking about what we are today. And this is, data from Finbin, once again, compiled by our friends at AEI. And they go through, and each year they rank the most to least profitable farms. And they've charted this out to suggest that the top 20% of the most profitable producers almost always have a lower machinery investment per acre than their counterparts on the lowest 20%. And so the reason that we share this with you is that if you're in that, in that moderate ground where you're looking to increase profitability, we hope that you'll use some of those strategies that Gary and I have talked about so that you continue to stay in that highest 20% of profitable producers with that lowest machinery investment per acre. And so not to flip those two and start to become in that lowest 20% with your highest machinery cost per acre. It's so important to make sure that every asset on the farm is not underutilized and that you're utilizing that capital in the best way possible. And so one of the ways that folks often think about this is, I just got to run that asset over more acres, Gary. And so buyer beware is what we've kind of named this next slide. Talk to us about maybe these silver bullet solutions that maybe aren't as easy as they seem.
Yeah, one of the most common things we probably hear is if someone does get maybe invested a little bit too high in their equipment per acre, is that um, they want to start going doing some custom hire application. So, say they go out and they buy that sprayer like we talked about in the other scenario on their own, and to help justify the cost, they're going to pick up some acres and spray some acres for some of their neighbors. And that could be for any really asset. It could be for a planter, a combine, anything like that. But really, you got to step back and really try to identify what's that true cost of providing this service. And it's really easy to justify the equipment, the principal and interest payments. It's like as you see that income coming in, you're like, it's making my payments. Oh, this is a no-brainer. This is a great deal. Well, there are operating costs to be doing custom hire work, and I mean, you got your maintenance, you got your fuel. Those are pretty obvious, but one of the things that probably consistently gets missed is really that economic depreciation or even physical depreciation on that asset. So as you think about it, if you're going over a significant amount of acres year over year on a custom hire piece, and you're not factoring in that cost of your physical depreciation of that asset, that just means you're going to have to replace that asset much more quickly than you would if you just use it on your acres. So you got there is a cost that you got to put in there for that, because if not, it's really may not be that economically beneficial to you to uh, run over those additional custom hire acres. Also, another key thing is if that's a significant if that industry really grows, that custom hire piece grows for you, and you pick up a lot of acres, how does that take you away from your current operation? Are you going to get your own crops in on a timely manner? Are you going to be able to still efficiently run your operation while still servicing your customer needs? So take that into consideration. How are you going to manage all your time through that? And then also, what's the competition in your area? Is there other custom applicators in there you're going to have to compete with? Are you going to get pricing pressures from them? So those are things to really consider if you're trying to get into that custom hire business, because a lot of times it may not be as profitable as you think, but in a lot of instances, I've seen it work really well for some individuals, and it fits very nicely. But just make sure you go through those three things before you jump into any into that type of custom hire arrangements, and make sure it's really a fit for your operation.
So the next piece of this overall puzzle is kind of planning for the future. And so talk to us about that capital expenditure plan and what do folks need to be thinking about?
Yeah, and I think this is really important for any operation, regardless of size that you are. A CapEx plan or capital expenditure plan is really, it can be very formal or it can be very informal. So don't overthink this too much. But really, it's just mapping out what your future purchases are going to be. You can do this on for the next 12 months, for the next 3 years, for the next 5 years. But it's kind of that roadmap of you identifying on your operation what's needed, what's my immediate needs, what are a couple pieces of equipment that I really have to replace within the next 12 months, and then kind of just stepping back and saying what's the cost to buy a new asset versus what's the cost of what it's been for me to continually repair that asset. Also, something that you can consider too is what's the efficiency of your existing asset? Is it breaking down constantly, causing some efficiencies and getting your crop planted or harvested in a timely manner? Those are things that also play into this CapEx plan as well. But really, one thing that you can add to your CapEx plan is use those ratios that we talked about earlier. And how does this purchase in the next 12 months impact my debt per acre or my equipment expense ratio? How does those things, how do you manage debts that are currently on your balance sheet maybe ones that are rolling off with ones you're wanting to put on, and make sure you're in that moderate or low risk before you're really taking on another big purchase. So you can do that throughout multiple years and really kind of have that roadmap so you got a good idea of what your capital needs are going to be in the near future.
You know, we talk a lot about annual financial updates at Farm Credit Mid-America, and this is one of those prime time conversations, if you will, when doing that AFU to have this conversation with your financial officer so that they can plan their loan request accordingly as well, right? So the more that Gary's team knows when going through these credit packages, what your plan is for the future, the better that our team is able to kind of coach and support you through that process as well. And so we've thrown a lot of information at you, and we've talked about machinery management. We really wanted to kind of boil this down into three key takeaways that we hope that after today's call, you'll start to consider and maybe even do on your farm. And so number one, evaluate your equipment cost. Number one is the equipment cost less than 12% of your GFI? That is something you can calculate pretty quickly, as Gary alluded to, just using your most recent income statement and balance sheet, and going through and doing that quick calculation to determine that. Number two is, what is the machinery investment compared to other similar sized operations? Do you have more machinery than maybe you really need on your farm? And does that give you the opportunity to take action and implement one of those strategies that we discussed, like inventorying your equipment and considering sharing specialized equipment? And then third, but certainly not least, create a capital expenditure plan. Figure out what pieces of equipment on your operation need the most attention, and discuss that plan with your financial officer so that you can start to get to a point where you feel really comfortable about how much equipment expenses you have on your farm, and can get you to a point where you're continuing to invest in equipment that's going to be utilized effectively on your operation, while also kind of keeping those financial ratios in check. Gary, is there anything you would like to add here as we kind of close out with these three key takeaways?
I mean, yeah, I mean, just real quick, I think if anything, just have a good idea where your operation's at today. This is something that if you look at it year over year, understanding how these ratios move, that's important to help you make better management decisions. So if you're managing your operation that way and you understand where your equipment debt per acre is or your equipment expense ratio is on a year over year basis and how any new purchase impacts those, you're going to be a step ahead of a lot of your peers because you're making really well informed decisions and you're never really going to put your operation at any undue risk, because you may get a little bit too over leveraged in equipment. So those are just things that think through, do a little bit of financial planning, and I think it will pay you dividends in the future.
So now we're going to kind of close us out here today and answer whatever questions that you all may have. And so a few folks have submitted those via the chat, and we would welcome you to continue to do that as those questions roll in. But I'll kind of go through just a few of the first couple that we have here. Gary, the first one is a little bit more complex here. I don't know if we'll be able to give a straight answer, but the question revolves around, if you're selling multiple pieces of used equipment, is it easier to justify maybe purchasing one brand new tractor, as an example, after selling multiple different assets on the farm?
And it really depends in your situation and where you're at. Like if you're doing that just to replace all those older pieces of equipment, yeah, that may make sense to kind of consolidate into maybe one more general use tractor. If it's for maybe an expansion, it's hard to tell, but I think it goes back to where those ratios are really kind of independent of where you're at. I mean, really to this, actually, let me repeat or start over. They're really dependent on the size of your operation. So if you're looking at maybe selling 3 or 4 older tractors and buying one new big or larger tractor, if that still fits into that investment per acre piece that we talked about, or if it still doesn't push your debt per acre out of kind of out into the high risk, I think it's probably a pretty good purchase. Yeah, because then you got less costs of repairing maybe 3 or 4 tractors. You're only really focusing on one. So it really depends on your operation and what you're looking to move towards. So
This next one here is, what is the most unique thing that you all have seen when it comes to managing machinery cost on the farm?
I've seen a couple operations that actually work really well together. They're neighbors, really, and they one operation buys all the planting equipment, and one operation buys all the harvesting equipment. And so every spring and fall, they work together to plant all their crops across both operations, and then the other one focuses on harvesting all the crops on the operation. But they still provide labor and they work with each other back and forth. But it's really limited their capital cost across both operations because they share it like that. I've also heard of some other operations that this is a little bit more rare. It can work and it can be very difficult to manage, but I've also seen some that don't own hardly any equipment whatsoever and they just purely have everything custom farmed. I know most of you are probably thinking, well, how do they get their stuff on a timely basis? Um, some of them just put bids out there, and whoever gets the bid gets it, and they got to have it planted or harvested by such and such time. And for some individuals, that's a good cash flow income, and they really want to do that, so they go and they'll do that before they even plant or harvest their own crops. So those are probably the two most unique ways I've seen stuff done. There's a lot of other ways to manage your equipment, but yeah, those are probably the most unique.
Got another one that just came in, Gary. Assuming your financial position is good, what is the best way to determine the sweet spot for a time to trade in a combine, let's say? Do we see, anything around engine hours or trade value maximized that you've picked up on through your years?
Yeah, I usually don't get that level of information from where I'm sitting, but what I've typically seen that sweet spot is really just looking at your debt per acre and really paying attention if you're doing your capex plan of, let's just say you got a tractor payment and you got two other fairly sizable payments rolling off and your debt per acre rolls down to a very, very low risk. That then provides you that cushion then to take on a large payment for a combine. So if you're just using your pure finances, that's a good sweet spot is when you have enough payments roll off that when you throw that big combine payment on there, it's not really going to stress your operation. That's a really, in my opinion, that's a good time. Now, I know there's a ton of other variables, timing and all that. Sometimes you may have to go into high risk for maybe a year until a payment rolls off, but that's fine. You know that you can manage around that. That's just something to think through.
I think that brings us to the end here of the questions that were submitted. So we do really appreciate you joining us this morning. We will send out this recording, and we look forward to the next time that we get to cross paths with you all. So thank you so much.
Thank you.